that you were capable of dealing with, and so I fell for that, and so I'm back again with you dealing with racial segregation. But before we get into racial segregation, Alana, let's talk about your background, your education, and some of your experiences, and then we'll start talking about the topic itself.
Well, for our new viewers, my name is Alana McLaughlin, born August 27th, 2002. I went to pre-K at Napier Elementary and multiple schools after that, and I currently go to John Early Museum Magnet Middle School, where I'm in 6th grade. Now, I'm very involved in church and other activities. Actually, this upcoming summer of 2014, I'm going to be attending the Junior National Young Leaders Conference in Washington, D.C. And if you're not familiar with the conference, it is basically where children all around America come together for a 1 week in Washington, D.C., which is parents free, where you experience Washington as a living classroom instead of being just a tourist or a resident of Washington. And so I'm very excited for that. And I'm also heavily involved in my school, church, and any activity I can really get into. Like at school, I'm on our debate team, the student council, everything I can get into, really. I was previously on our STEP team, and I hope to be a cheerleader next year when I get into 7th grade. And in church, I'm on a lot of committees. The United Methodist Women's Committee, the Acolyte Committee, the Usher Committee. I try to help it when I can, because I just feel like that's my duty on earth.
Very good. And of course, Lana, you've been involved with a lot of things. But now let's look at the topic that you're dealing with today, racial segregation. Now, what would you say about that? How would you approach that topic?
Racial segregation. When the average person would hear that, they would think, the 1900s, Martin Luther King marching, MLK, Malcolm X type thing. But then racial segregation was more than just, the Jim Crow era, or just African Americans and segregated buses or sit-ins or anything. But it was way more than that. It expanded from just African Americans, Europeans, Ukrainians, Germans, Italians, because almost every race has experienced racial segregation. Now, going as far back in African American culture, you would think slavery. African Americans were enslaved and made to work and beaten if they did something wrong, or just beaten for their slave owners' amusement. And so that's as far back as I can previously think of for African Americans. But then for Europeans and Ukrainians and Germans, the Holocaust, or in the 14th and 15th century, Europeans were segregated just like African Americans were in the 19th era. And so basically, racial segregation just expands from just African Americans to just a lot of other places, like mulattoes and Europeans and just all races, really, because at least almost all races have experienced some type of racial segregation.
Very good. And so it's really general in terms of, and is that why you wanted to talk about racial separation and segregation, not only in the United States, but racial separation and segregation all over the world, because you believe it's general and it's a problem everywhere you find it? Because
not a lot of people really know that. Like, so I could hear somebody say, oh, no, white people, they didn't experience racial segregation. It was only black people when Martin Luther King had a march for us, or the Rose Park situation. It was more than that. It was almost all races.
And so, from that perspective, when we come back, I want you to sort of delve into what you consider to be some of the major elements and some of the major things that has to do with racial segregation and racial separation. I think you've already indicated in a real sense that it's general and all over the world and everywhere. And I think that I can say from some of the things that you've said on this program itself that you are now enlisting yourself into the war against racial separation and racial segregation. And of course, we're going to talk about that, and we'll be back with you following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is racial separation or racial segregation, and Alana has given us a taste of some of the things that she believes will play a very, very significant part in terms of separating the races. Let's pick up from where we left off when we spoke with this last segment, Alana.
Well, for viewers just turning in, I am indeed Alana McLaughlin, born August 27, 2002. I'm 11 years old. I am in 6th grade at John Early Museum Magnet Middle School. And in the previous segment, we talked about my background in education. Then we sort of got into racial segregation. Now, in the first segment, I stated that racial segregation was not only for African Americans, but it was all over. And most people don't really realize this, but it is always happening. It's still happening now. Like, for instance, once I went into a shop and I looked at an expensive piece of jewelry, a necklace, and then a sales lady, she looked at me and she said, "Do you really think you can afford that?" Because I mean, I wasn't all really done up that day. You know, my hair was crazy. I almost had on pajamas, leggings, and so basically, that still is racial separation, because a lot of people don't really realize that we have overcome that era and that it's no longer African Americans are poor, and I don't even like that mind frame that people use nowadays. Like President Obama. We did expect it, but we never knew that we would have a black president, because there are still people today who crazily think that, oh, black people are ghetto and that they're only good for making food or cleaning, and that they're all bald-headed and they all listen to rap music. I don't think I'm bald-headed. I'm fully black. I have an African-American mother and an African-American father. I don't think I'm bald-headed. I don't really like rap music. So that's a stereotype that I don't like. And then there's a stereotype about Caucasian people who they all drink Starbucks and they're all blonde to like Instagram, this social media website. Don't even get me started. But that's crazy, and that's still people using this mind frame of they want to separate people. Like there's still people today who think Hispanics only eat tacos, or they're poor in the lower class. It's crazy. I mean, because have we not already overcome this? Did Martin Luther King not die for this? Like, he didn't die for this. He died so that we could all think we were all equal and that we could all be equal, because we are. He didn't die for African American boys, or any boy, for instance, to be walking down the street with their pants at their knees, and this stereotype of that African Americans are dangerous people who carry guns and knives, and all of them have weave. Or it's crazy, and I don't like it, because I actually, when I go down the street or when I see anything really, I always on TV it's depicted as African Americans are this way or that way. Then there are the African Americans who think that they're higher than people, and I just think that we're all equal. We're all one, basically. We're all made in the image of God. I don't think that she's higher than him or he's higher than her. The highest up would be God to me, and I may be wrong, but I don't think I am. And so basically, I just want us to all be equal, because we are, and I wish people would see that. Like, I am sick and tired of going on Facebook and seeing someone say, "I saw this girl, she got robbed today by this black girl," and just cut the black out of it, okay? Okay, that black part did not need to be added. Okay, she got robbed. Okay, that could happen anywhere. A Hispanic girl could have robbed her. A white girl could have robbed her. A black girl could have robbed her. What is it about African Americans that make people think that we're all so dangerous, that we all love fried chicken and Kool-Aid? And this is stuff that I've seen on the internet. I once read a blog post on Tumblr that said that African Americans' favorite food, that their favorite meal was Kool-Aid and fried chicken. That is the most stereotypical racist thing I have ever read in my life, besides reading some of these U.S. Supreme Court cases. And now back to now back to racial segregation, because I kind of got off topic. Now, see, as I said in the first segment, that the earliest sign of racial segregation was slavery. Now, if you're not familiar with slavery, slavery was when African Americans were enslaved by Caucasians or people of different races. I'm not going to single white people out, but then they were enslaved by different races and made to work and clean and cook because that other races thought they were higher up on a financial or on just a regular scale than us African Americans or us people of different races. And so they thought that, hey, we can abuse them or we can batter them and we can just kick them around for our own amusement, because at the time that was something funny. And now see, when I look back at this, I still see people who think that we're in slavery days. I still see people in my own, not in my community, but like in my own little bubble of world, in the places I go, I still see people who think that black people aren't good for anything. And this is stuff that I see on social media, on Facebook, Vine and stuff. And then people want to make jokes out of it, and it's not funny. I mean, like, that would be like you going up to a Jewish person and drawing a swastika on your hand and saying, ha, 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 you're in the Holocaust. Like, that's not funny. You don't joke about that stuff, because that's just not funny, basically. And so I'm just trying to get the word out and just tell people that, hey, I mean, just let's move forward instead of going back into the past. I mean, yes, we have to learn about the past to make the future. Like, I wouldn't be preaching right now if I didn't know about Martin Luther King and his struggles and Malcolm X and all. But I still say, let's just not recreate the past, because not all of it was pretty beautiful. So how about we recreate a future where we all think we're equal and we love our neighbor, instead of, you know, just hating people and thinking that we're better than people, because we're all equal. Nobody's better than anybody. Nobody's just, we're equal. We're all people. We're all made with the same things. We almost all have hair and eyes. We're all humans. We all have souls, and we're people. We're just Homo sapiens.
And so, Lana, in a real sense, all of this information that you have in reference to racial separation and segregation, I know has to have some kind of factual basis behind it, and I think you've talked about some of the factual basis of the beginning of racial separation and et cetera and et cetera. And so when we deal with this final segment, I want you to deal with some of the court cases and some of the things that made for racial separation. So in spite of everything that you've said, there was a system that separated people constitutionally, and that's what we want to try to deal with when we come back, because I think that you've got some information that can give some credit to those individuals who have fought against some of the things that you're trying to fight against now. We can certainly appreciate that, but when we come back, let's look at some of the factual information that you have dealing with racial separation and racial segregation, and then we'll be able to, from that point on, analyze where we are going from this particular point, because I think everything that you've said is exciting and et cetera, but it really does not lay the foundation as to how we move forward. That information that you have will deal with that. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. The topic is racial separation or racial segregation, and Lana has given us quite a bit of information in reference to her attitude toward equality and her attitude toward the separation of the races. But Lana, let's look at it a little deeper in terms of some of the other information that you have.
Now, in the previous segments, I did say that I was Alana McLaughlin. I am Alana McLaughlin. I am 11 years old, and I go to John Early Middle School. Now, then that was the first segment, background education. Now, the second segment, I talked about how my views on racial segregation and racial separation, you know, the bus boycotts and Rosa Parks' situation, and Dr. King and how he marched for us in Malcolm X. Now, this last segment, I want to get down to a more of a factual basis, because in the previous episodes, I have given more of a commentary basis. Now, let's talk about board versus education. Now, I think that the majority of African Americans are familiar with this U.S. Supreme Court case. Now, but if you're not, I'll give you a little basis on it. The Brown versus the Board of Education was a case that basically
Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. The topic is racial separation or racial segregation, and the guest is Alana McLaughlin. Alana has given us some information in reference to some of the things that she believed to be important in her own personal life, and now I think she will talk about some of the factual information in reference to separation and segregation. Let's talk about it from that perspective, Alana.
As Dr. Haney already stated, my name is Alana McLaughlin. I am 11 years old, and I go to John Early Middle School. Now, in these past segments, I've given more of a commentary based on like my opinion on it and how I feel and how I'm tied into it. But now I want to get down to more of a factual basis. Now, let's talk about the Brown versus Board of Education U.S. Supreme Court case. Now, I think the majority of African Americans are familiar with this case, but if you're not, I'll give you a little basis on it. The Brown versus Board of Education case was basically 1/3 of how we got integrated schools. Now, integrated schools are schools that have multiple races in it. Before, we would have just a Caucasian school or an African American school or this or that. But then the Brown versus Board of Education case basically said, hey, what's wrong with having integrated schools? I mean, because we already see African American kids who have Caucasian friends. Martin Luther King, for instance, he had a Caucasian friend, but then he was forced to stop meeting with his friend because his parents thought he was in danger of a Klan incident because he was friends with a Caucasian boy and he was African American. Now, see, integrated schools, basically. If you're familiar with like the Little Rock Nine, then you should know a lot about it. But then let me talk about the Little Rock Nine. The Little Rock Nine were a group of 9 students who went to Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, who basically said, you know what, they were basically the first people to really join in with the Integrated Schools Act. And so that's basically how we got integrated schools. Now, Brown versus Education, as I've previously stated, said that, you know, we need integrated schools. There's nothing wrong with it. And that's basically almost like how we got segregation ended. But then the Brown versus Board of Education case focused more on school and education, as segregation focused more on just daily life and how you would act if you went out to eat, or bus boycotts and things like that. Now, another famous case is the Plessy versus Ferguson U.S. Supreme Court case of 1898. Now, on June 7, 1892, Homer A. Plessy was removed from the East Louisiana Railroad train and arrested by Detective C.C. Kane at the corner of Royal and Press Street for civil disobedience and violating the 1890 Louisiana Separate Car Act that separated railroad passengers by race. This soon inspired the Plessy versus Ferguson U.S. Supreme Court case, which stated that the state law which required East Louisiana railroads to segregate trains had denied him his rights under the 13th and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution. Now, if you're not familiar with the Constitution, I suggest you look that up. But because, see, I'm just going to jump right into it. Basically, this case was talking about Homer Adolph Plessy versus John H. Ferguson. Now, Homer A. Plessy, as I previously stated, was taken off a East Louisiana railroad car and arrested for civil disobedience because he apparently violated the 1890 Louisiana Railroad Car Act. Now, see, basically, the people who sold him his ticket sold him the ticket for a whites-only car, knowing his race. So basically, they set him up to fall. So personally, I think that that he was not at fault for anything because he was not aware that he had a whites-only ticket until he got on the bus, and then Detective C.C. Kane came up and said, "You're under arrest for civil disobedience." Then he finally went, "Oh, they sold me a ticket for the whites-only car when I'm obviously African-American." Now, see, thankfully, when they took this to the U.S. Supreme Court, Homer A. Plessy was not charged, as they previously stated he would be, but he finally understood how they basically tormented and bullied him because of the fact that he was African American. Now, see, this also ties in with bullying, which has expanded to modern day cyberbullying, which is bullying with, electronics like this iPhone or a computer and such. And so basically, that's one of the earliest instances on record of the U.S. Supreme Court case that basically shows that he was bullied. And so Homer Adolph Plessy was basically he got to live his life after this. He got to move forward, basically, and that's what I want to do in life. I want us African Americans, us Europeans, Germans, Italians, Creoles. I want us to move forward. Because I know that there will always be a place and we'll always have to look back and say, hey, we were in slavery and that we were in the Jim Crow era. But then I want us to move forward from that. I want us to make an era where we get to teach our children not to go around with their pants hanging at their knees or to do this to make a living. But I want us generation, because we're going to be the future leaders. My generation, we're going to be the people who kids have to look up and I look up to, and I don't want the future kids of the world to look up and say, hey, you know what, I want to be like this. I want to have a body full of tattoos. I want to curse out everybody in my path, and I want to dress like this, because I want a generation of classy, sophisticated people. And I'm not just saying that African Americans are saying that, oh, we should do this and do that. It's anybody. I want us to have a race of people who can be leaders, not people who other people look at and say, I don't even want my child around that. I don't want my child to be around to see this, because I want a generation where people can say, oh, I'm just so glad I raised my child like this. I don't want a generation of, look at that hooligan robbing a store. And I don't want a generation of stereotypes. Now, if you're not familiar with stereotypes, you probably already know one, like the black people only eat fried chicken and drink Kool-Aid stereotype. Those are types of stereotypes where people think that a race does this, but really we don't. I mean, not all African Americans like fried chicken and Kool-Aid. Not all African Americans dress like this or listen to that, because we're all unique. I mean, with the same skin color, we're all Homo sapiens, but we have different personalities because we're all different. But then we're all the same in a